Okay, so in chapter 13, what we're going to talk about is the macroeconomy and its fluctuations, as we did in chapter 12, and then specifically the role of government. And so, what we're going to do is we're going to build a pretty simple macroeconomic model that focuses on consumer spending and investment spending and see why those two go up and down. And then, what can the government do to come in and try to improve the situation if there's a recession, or even cool things off if the economy is expanding too fast? So, what we saw in chapter 12 was that consumption and investment decisions, especially, can lead to fluctuations in GDP. And one of the questions then, and one of the questions that was first asked during the Great Depression, especially, is what can the government do to try to smooth out the business cycle, right? If we said, hey, one of the biggest costs of the business cycle is all of these people who are unemployed, then can the government do something to get rid of recessions and keep people who want to work working? And so we're going to talk a little bit about that, but in order to do that, we need to build a model that shows why the economy is fluctuating in the first place. So we can see that the size of the government has actually increased fairly substantially in the United States since about 1870, where government revenue as a percent of GDP was, a little bit less than 10% until the beginning of the First World War, and then it has grown pretty steadily up until about 1980, and it's been pretty steady since then. So if we just look, we can see, point A is where World War I ended, and the 20s were a time of big prosperity, but ended, of course, with the start of the Great Depression. And part of the New Deal and President Roosevelt's plan to get us out of the Great Depression was to increase spending, which did, so that's sort of at point C. But really the big increase in spending didn't come until World War II. And so World War II came, and spending increased, stayed at a pretty high level, over 20%. And then we started what was called the War on Poverty, as well as, of course, the Vietnam War. And so spending increased even more at points E and F. 1970, we were at about 30%, and we've pretty much stayed at 30% there. We had a brief blip in the early 80s, but other than that, we're still sort of right around that 30%. And just keep in mind that includes federal, state, and local spending, as well as transfers in this case. This is total government revenue, not just the G in the C plus I plus G plus X minus IM, which is about 20%. So we want to build a model of aggregate demand, right? How much are people spending, and then how can the government help or hurt the economy when we're in a recession? And so we're going to start with consumption. And obviously, consumption spending takes place in over 100 million households. And those households vary by how big they are, how much money they make, how old they are. And we're going to simplify all that and look at all of the households together. And so we're going to break up consumer spending into two pieces. One that is dependent on how much income the economy has, and one that is not related to how much income the economy has. And so we're going to look at this in the next slide and sort of build it up piece by piece. So what we have here is a graph where output, GDP, is on the horizontal axis, right? Remember, Y is often used to refer to GDP, and consumer spending is on the vertical axis. Now, there's going to be some amount of autonomous consumption, which we'll call C0, which doesn't depend on current income. We need to consume that much no matter what. And so that's going to be things like, how much we can eat, shelter and things like that. But you can think of that sort of as the basic necessities. But as income increases, we're going to consume more. And so we can write a very simple consumption function where the intercept is C0, right? That's here. And then consumption increases by some amount, C1, for each extra dollar of income. And we're going to call that the marginal propensity to consume, or MPC. So in this case, we're calling it 0.6, which seems like a relatively good estimate for the economy overall. Keep in mind that that's hiding a lot of difference between households. A poor household that gets an extra $100 of income is going to spend most of it. So their MPC will be 0.9 or 0.95. Whereas a really rich household will consume less of it. They might consume only $20 or $30 of it and save the rest because they already have a lot of money. And of course, since rich households have more of the money, they tend to be a larger weight in our consumption function. So the slope of the consumption function is just equal to C1, which is the marginal propensity to consume, and which in this case is 0.6. What we know in general is that the marginal propensity to consume will be less than 1, right? You can't spend more than $1 for extra dollar of income that you get. So is this a reasonable picture of consumer spending? Well, it's not unreasonable, and a lot of it has to do with how confident consumers are, right? And so that MPC can change depending on whether consumers are feeling confident or feeling nervous. And so this is what was going on during the Great Recession. You can see the Consumer Sentiment Index, which is just based on a survey, is this dashed line. And you can see people were feeling pretty nervous, right? This is just an index, so you can see it fell by about 20% over the course of the Great Recession. Real disposable income didn't actually fall by that much, right? It went up a bit in 2008, then came back down, and then was basically flat. But because of people's nervousness, we can see that consumer spending, especially on durable goods, things like cars, refrigerators, dishwashers, washer dryers, fell significantly by about 10%. And even consumption of non-durable goods, which are things like food and clothes, fell by 2 or 3 percentage points, right? Those are the things you can't cut too much because you need to eat to live, but it still fell. And so consumer spending can fluctuate, and we can see one of the things that will shift our aggregate demand is when consumers are more confident or less confident.